Sharon Hum, your response.
I'm sorry, was that
very
off,
quickly,
Professor
Sharon?
Blecher? Yeah. I think the lecturing China I think it's extremely important what Marc is saying about paying attention to potential negative effects of raising the human rights issues. And I totally agree that the real issue is what to do about it. But what to do about it is the starting point is what is already being done and what Chinese people are already attempting to do to reform and to address these issues. And it's not just political opponents. It's really too narrow and inaccurate characterization that the voices inside China that are raising issues are simply political dissidents. Liu Xiaobo himself was not only writing about political reform. He was raising issues of the slavery of children working in the brick kilns. He was raising issues of corruption. He was raising the issues that Chinese people themselves are raising and that the lawyers are attempting to raise, and that when lawyers, the Beijing Lawyers Association, this is what they're doing. In the law area, the Beijing Lawyers Association called for direct elections instead of party-appointed leaders of their own bar association. They were threatened, had their licenses suspended, and also had their law firms, some of them, one of them, shut down. When Chinese women's rights groups became too strong and got too much support from the international funders, they too, most recently the Beida Women's Center, was shut down. So independent media continue to write. You have over 400 million online netizens. You have hundreds of millions of bloggers. And what they're doing is not only raising political issues. They're raising the environment. They're raising health. They're raising tainted milk scandals where 100,000 children have been affected. They're raising workers' rights. They're raising the problem of wholesale theft of their land in the villages. So
you think Tunisia is making them afraid, the revolution there? Before
Tunisia, there was the color revolution. And before the color revolution, that was what was happening in the former Soviet Union. So the Chinese authorities were watching very carefully and were paying attention. And in fact, for the color revolution, they sent teams of researchers to study the Cultural Revolution and produced an inside internal report, which was on these were the dangers of the Cultural Revolution. So most recently, Tunisia, where the riots have been fueled by rising food prices, where China's food prices have risen to over 7% with high unemployment, including now reaching the university graduates where they have no job possibilities. It's reaching beyond these 700 rural inhabitants. There is now rising protests and social unrest in China. And China's very worried about the Jasmine Revolution.
But those protests are coming in the face at the same time of enormous growth in prosperity for huge numbers of the Chinese compared to their previous existence. So you have the problem of the need for individual space for expression, while at the same time people's lives are getting better for a significant number of the population, not all.
Yeah, I think that the number of 200 million people lifted out of poverty is absolutely right. And the challenges facing China are complex and difficult. And China, despite its one-party state, despite its lack of space for civil society, has made very important progress in some of these areas. But the 200 million lifted out of poverty needs to be balanced in perspective. It wouldn't mean too much to you if you were one of the 400 million who are drinking water contaminated by human waste. It wouldn't mean very much to you if you were one of the 200 million over migrants whose children have no access to education or health care. And it wouldn't mean too much to you if you were one of the 700 million, that's double the population of the U.S., who are living with a rural, what they call a HUCO, household registration system, where there's a complete collapse of basic services and basic goods. We're not talking about freedom of expression. We're talking about fundamental human dignity and right to housing, homes, jobs, water, health.
And Professor Blecher, the Chinese criticism of the United States when it comes to issues of human economic rights?
Well, as we know, the Chinese take a view of human rights that's very different than ours, one that they say emphasizes social and economic rights, whereas we emphasize political rights. And so in some sense, we're talking at cross purposes. I think the way they hear our criticisms of their problems in political rights would be mirrored if they lectured us on economic and social issues in this country. Now, they're not in much of a position to do that. I'm very glad to hear what Sharon said about how her notion of human rights actually includes the tremendous suffering of poor people, sweatshop workers, impoverished farmers, and the like in China. So China is not in much of a position to lecture us on economic and social rights either, just as I think we are ill-advised to lecture them on political rights. On the wider question of political expression in China, I would hate for audiences to think that China is a place where no one can speak out on anything. In fact, what Sharon has told us is exactly the opposite. There is a tremendously broad and increasing scope for all manner of political debate and expression in China these days. There are lively debates in the Chinese press, in Chinese universities, in all manner of media, on all sorts of policy issues about the environment, about health care, and so on. A Chinese-born political science colleague of mine, who 10 years ago was trying to get some progress on issues around policy issues around health care, around coal miners' deaths, around wages, things like this. 10, 15 years ago, he and like-minded young Chinese scholars tried to influence the Chinese government, working through existing channels by writing policy papers and trying to get executive summaries of their articles and their policy recommendations onto the desks of leading officials. Today, they do it very differently. They advocate their positions by publishing op-eds in Chinese newspapers. There is an increasing scope for lively political debate in China. There are certain boundaries that people know they shouldn't cross. Calling for competitive elections that might throw the Chinese Communist Party out of power is a no-no. Liu Xiaobo was very brave in raising all the issues that Sharon mentioned. The reason he got in so much trouble was not because he raised issues of poverty and so on, but because he called for the abolition of the People's Republic of China. Now, he should be able to do that, but the fact is that that's the limit. But short of that limit, there's tremendous scope for debate in China today, and we should applaud that, and we should allow the conditions for that to grow. The problem with badgering China about political human rights is that the more we do it, the more the government cracks down, and the more difficult it is to actually expand the scope for debate. The best way we can do things to improve political rights and political expression in China is to help create the conditions in which the Chinese government feels increasingly secure.
Professor Blecher, we're going to break. We're going to go on to the issue of the economy, with the enormous economy that China is. 10 seconds for response, Sharon Hum, though, as we wrap up this segment.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important that it's not human rights in China or my own particular personal notion of human rights, and that after World War II, there is an international human rights system which Chinese government has signed on to every major international human rights treaties. So that's the framework of accountability that we're really talking about, and that Chinese citizens themselves, including the 10,000 more signers of Charter 08, are calling for the implementation in domestic law of international human rights. So
Sharon Hum, thanks so much for being with us, Executive Director of Human Rights in China. We'll go on to talk about China's position in the world when it comes to the amount of money they spend and also the economy that is ever expanding. Stay with us.